Writers have for years come up with movies that detail horrifying and disturbing fates vampires are uniquely cursed to live through. However, it's not just vampires on the receiving end of these disastrous fates, as in many of these movies, human characters can end up in just as bleak scenarios where they wish they were dead. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 vampire movie fates worse than death. Number 10. Interview with a Vampire. Trapped in the body of a child. Interview with a Vampire is one of the most famous and well-loved vampire movies of all time. The cast included none other than Hollywood heavyweights Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, and Christian Slater. It also included a Golden Globe-nominated performance by the then 11-year-old Kirsten Dunst. Dunst plays a little girl named Claudia, who gets turned into a vampire by Tom Cruise's character, the ancient vampire Lestat, as a surrogate daughter for Brad Pitt's miserable and newly turned character Lewis. At first, things are going pretty swimmingly, and the two men raise Claudia as their own. For Lestat, she becomes his pupil, training with him to become a ruthless monster akin to himself. For Lewis, she replaces the hole left by his own dead wife and unborn child, the more touching of the two relationships. But when 30 years go by and Claudia realizes she'll never be able to age visibly, even though she does mentally, things start to go sour. The realization that she'll be forever trapped in a child's body is enough to make Claudia snap and try to kill Lestat for what he's done to her. Number 9. Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 1. Eaten from the inside by your own vampire spawn. For a film franchise predominantly blown up by preteen girls, there's a shocking amount of gore in the last two Twilight movies. When our main characters Edward and Bella finally tied the knot in the first half of the two-part finale, fans got what they've been waiting for 3 movies. Or should I say, what the quote-unquote Twilight moms had been waiting for: the couple to consummate their marriage. However, the couple soon regretted their decision to do that unprotected, when Bella shockingly gets pregnant with Edward's undead baby. From there, the movie goes straight into alien territory, gory body horror and all. The baby or demon spawn is something no one in the Cullen clan have ever come across, and for the rest of the movie, the vampires brood in waiting while Bella goes through the most horrific pregnancy of all time. The poor human girl, adamant that she keep the child, begins to be eaten alive by the parasitic-like baby. The pregnancy develops at an unusually fast rate, and as Bella's stomach grows rapidly, the rest of her body wastes away grotesquely until there's barely anything left but skin and bone. The thought of being consumed from the inside by your own baby is horrifying, and the fact that Bella ends up having to drink human blood through a straw just to feed it must have been utterly traumatizing. If that's not enough for you, the pregnancy culminates in Edward having to rip the baby out of her with his teeth while she watches on helplessly. There's no way a normal person could ever love a child so monstrous after that, but the Cullens are definitely not normal. Number 8. Thirst. A saint being forced into becoming a sinner. Thirst is a South Korean film about a Catholic priest called Sang-hyun. The movie sees him turned into a vampire against his will when he selflessly volunteers for a medical trial to find a cure for a virus that's ravaging the country. After being injected with the virus during the trial, his health quickly deteriorates and he's given a blood transfusion to try and save him. However, the blood has come from a questionable source, and mysteriously, Sang-hyun makes a full recovery very soon after. It's soon revealed that the blood has transformed Sang-hyun into a vampire. The film then follows his struggles with his need for human blood. He wrestles with his new cursed life in particular because of his Catholic nature, and even tries to kill himself because of his guilt. The film is a perfect capsule for the dichotomy of good and evil, and it's awful to watch Sang-hyun slip into a more and more monstrous state. As the film progresses, our protagonist commits increasingly horrific and unforgivable acts. He steals blood from a blood bank, abandons his church, and escalates to murdering his childhood best friend. That third one is definitely the worst. In the final act of the movie, in what could be seen as his most evil action, Sang-hyun turns his love into a vampire after she begs him to kill her and put her out of her misery. The good Sang-hyun from the beginning of the movie slowly wastes away, and the audience is left thinking that he probably would have fared better if he died from the clinical trial at the start. Number 7. Blade. Turned into a mutated zombie-like vampire. What's scarier than turning into a vampire? Turning into a zombie-vampire hybrid? Well, unfortunately for Curtis Webb, those were the cards he was dealt. In the movie Blade, based on the Marvel comic book series of the same name, the vampires are created because of a virus. The bite that vampires give to humans is considered to infect them with the vampiric virus, and a subplot of the movie sees a young hematologist named Karen search for a cure, after getting bitten by a burn victim vampire in the ER. Karen is able to find a cure for herself just in time before the virus takes over, but she wasn't the only doctor bitten that night. Curtis is Karen's ex-boyfriend and current co-worker, and we don't learn much about him, just that he's a bit full of himself and quite pushy. Still, he definitely didn't deserve what happens to him. When Curtis is bitten, something strange ensues. Instead of turning into a powerful blood-sucking demon, he transforms into a macabre, decaying creature, similar to a zombie. Curtis starts to slowly lose his mind, driven insane by his new desire to feed. Unlike most vampires, he doesn't just feed on humans, but on any creature he can get his hands on. The last we see of Curtis, he's become a pet of the evil vampire and villain of the movie, Frost. He's kept in a pit of human bones where Frost can throw his victims for Curtis to feed upon with depravity. It's a twisted take on a vampire fate that left audiences with a sick feeling for sure. Number 6. Dark Shadows. Trapped in a coffin and doomed to be eternally thirsty. When it was originally announced that a Tim Burton Dark Shadows remake was in the works, starring the likes of Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter, people were understandably excited. However, while the movie had that familiar Burton flair, the charm of it was lost on the audience due to the nonsensical plot and oversaturated 70s style. The movie decided to go down a campier route instead of leaning into its horror elements, though there was one particularly nasty bit in the intro. When the film begins, we see Barnabas Collins all the way back in 1760, human and engaged to a beautiful young woman. When Barnabas gets on the wrong side of an evil witch, his family and fiancé are murdered, and he's cursed to live alone, eternally a vampire. The witch turns the town against the once loved man, and they overpower him and trap him inside a coffin, burying him underground, hopefully for eternity. And he would have been there for eternity if the gentrification of Collinsport hadn't led to a group of construction men digging at the site of his burial in 1972. The vampire had been buried for over 200 years, stuck eternally awake because of that whole being a vampire thing. That led to an unending thirst for human blood, but the movie quickly moves past this fact to make room for the convoluted plot. But the implication of this is absolutely horrifying. 200 years alone, buried and insatiably thirsty, it's enough to drive anyone insane. Number 5. Daybreakers. Drained in a human blood farm. In the film Daybreakers, there are two horrendous fates to choose from, and honestly, both are pretty bleak. The first is a fate that the vampires themselves are often doomed to live through, and the second, more chilling fate is bestowed upon the poor innocent humans. In a world where vampires are the dominant race and humans are dying out, vampire scientists are hard-pressed to find a substitute for human blood for the population to feed on. You see, within this particular lore, vampires don't just die out if they can't feed. They turn into these mutated human-sized bat creatures. They become completely crazed, forced to live in the sewers, and nothing can be done to reverse this transformation. It's honestly pretty disturbing. Although that's a completely horrifying way to live your life, it's not as bad as what happens to the humans of this film. As stated before, humans are a dying race, and vampires have to go to extreme lengths to provide blood to the public. Enter the human blood farms. We see in the film that instead of searching for humans to feed on whenever they're thirsty, humans are hunted down and taken to factories, where they're hooked up to machines and drained of their blood for the rest of their lives. It is obviously a miserable existence, and the idea is something that'll haunt you long after the film ends. The scariest part is how trivialized it seems to be in the film. The characters don't even bat an eye at the horrific fates they're sentencing the human race to. Number 4. A Vampire's Kiss. Psychosis driving you to believe that you're a vampire. A Vampire's Kiss should have been warning of what was to come from the infamous Nicolas Cage. The movie was divisive to say the least at the time, but now boasts a huge cult following, with audiences now more than willing to accept Cage as an eccentric guy who makes, questionable acting choices. This movie's played for laughs, but there's an undercurrent of uneasiness that flows throughout the film's runtime. Cage plays a self-obsessed literary agent named Peter, with underlying mental health issues. At the beginning of the film, he's already in therapy, but that doesn't seem to help him later on. In a scene taken straight out of your favorite vampire movie, we see a woman named Rachel pin Peter down and bite mercilessly into his neck. However, it's a sequence that the audience quickly realizes only happened in his head, and things get pretty weird from there. Peter starts having strange vampire-centric delusions, including being unable to see his own reflection, and it's all fun and games until his clear psychosis takes a turn for the worse. Disturbingly, Peter starts harassing women in an attempt to feed on them. He assaults a lady lady he works with and eventually attacks and kills a woman after biting her to try and drink her blood. How someone seemingly so successful can lose their mind to such a vivid delusion without anyone else realizing it is terrifying. Perhaps the only thing worse than becoming a vampire is not becoming one, but totally believing that you are. Number 3. Isle of the Dead. Buried alive and driven insane. This film isn't a vampire movie in the overt sense. There are no fanged femme fatales or blood-sucking monsters. Instead, the movie uses the Volvalaka, a type of energy-draining vampire from Greek folklore, as a symbol to highlight our fears and paranoia. In the movie, our main character, General Farides, visits the Isle of the Dead where his wife is buried to pay tribute to her. The island is pretty much uninhabitable, except for one house where a group is taking refuge to avoid a war that's being waged on the mainland. Among the group are 2 women, a paranoid Greek housekeeper named Kyra, and a young lady named Thea. When the house's inhabitants start dying of a mysterious plague, Kyra starts sharing her paranoia about young Thea being a Volvalaka with the other characters. The movie perfectly encapsulates the fear that would have ravaged in the minds of people during this time. Fears that included the supernatural, disease, and because of the island's various graves and tombs, the fear of being buried alive. While the plot is generally focused on the suspicions about Thea, the most fear-inducing moments come when another character, Mrs. St. Aubin, who's terrified of premature burial, gets buried alive because the characters believe her to be dead after she falls into a catatonic state. When she comes out of this state, she claws her way back to the land of the living and proceeds to go crazy, having been driven insane by what's been done to her. Number 2. Let Me In. Groomed to be a vampire's slave until you die. In Let Me In, our main protagonist Owen becomes friendly with the mysterious Abby, who lives next door. Owen believes that Thomas, the man that lives with Abby, is her father. But as the film unravels, it becomes obvious to the audience, as well as Owen, that everything is not as it seems. Abby is revealed to be a vampire, and Thomas turns out to not be her father, but her human companion. We see Thomas go to extreme lengths to protect Abby, including abducting and draining the bodies of various people and hiding the bodies of her victims. In a moment of pure selflessness, he throws acid on his face so that he's unrecognizable to the police. He later jumps out a window, leaving a note behind apologizing to Abby, presumably for getting caught. At this point in the movie, we're supposed to feel for Abby, believing that Thomas selflessly wanted to protect her because she's only a child. Owen believes this to be the case also, and it's only when he finds a photograph of Thomas as a young boy with Abby that he begins to understand what's going on. Abby's no child, but an ageless vampire trapped in a child's body. Her friendship with Owen suddenly feels gross, and the implication of her once having a similar relationship with Thomas is disturbing to say the least. The movie has a miserable ending, with Owen realizing that Abby's goal was to groom him into her next companion all along, and he tries to escape that fate, only to eventually give in and leave town with her in the movie's final moments. Number 1. 30 Days of Night. Trapped with vampires in an unending night. 30 Days of Night follows a group in Alaska entering the polar night, where the sun sets for an entire month. For what it's worth, this is generally very normal for the townspeople. However, the movie uses this seemingly mundane occurrence as the crux for its horror story. When a strange couple, Eben and Stella, along with several other townfolk, are trapped after the last flight leaves before the polar night, the worst possible thing happens. A horde of vampires swarm the town and cut the power and all communication to the outside world. Usually in a vampire movie, humans get the upper hand over the villainous bloodsuckers when the sun rises, and the undead have to retreat indoors as to not be burned to a crisp. In this movie though, there's no hope for the human townspeople. They're stuck in an unending night with no escape against a horde of vampires. We experience the claustrophobic feeling of this situation from the eyes of Eben and Stella. We have to witness the mutilations of their friends and neighbors, and we feel the exact same exhaustion they do as they spend their every waking moment in fear of an attack from the vampires. It's an inescapable long form of torture, and even if you survive, you have to live with that trauma and the knowledge that these monsters could descend whenever the sun sets. Let me know down in that comment section if you know of any other great vampire movie fates worse than death. As always, I've been Jess from What Culture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. You can find me on my Twitter where I'm @JessMcDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more content.